Hello, I'm Althea Brooks, and I'm Senior Director of Lifetime Learning in the University of Virginia's Office of Engagement. We are delighted to feature Kenneth G. Elzinga for our Reunions 2021 special talk. Ken has taught over 50,000 students in his 54 years in the Department of Economics. We're fortunate to have as his interviewer President Emerita Teresa Sullivan, Professor of Sociology. Both faculty are in the College and Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. Sit back, relax, and enjoy this in-depth conversation between two great faculty here at UVA.
So Ken, why don't we start by talking about some of your early years? Tell us where you grew up.
I was born in a little fly speck of a town in Michigan called Coopersville, Michigan, which is outside of Grand Rapids. And my father found better employment opportunities in Kalamazoo. So when I was a boy, we left a very rural farming community in Coopersville, where my grandfather had a farm and had settled there from the Netherlands. And we moved to Kalamazoo, where my dad found work in a machine shop. So technically, I'm from Coopersville. I grew up in Kalamazoo.
And I understand you're the first in your family to go to college?
I am. I'm first generation college. My brothers and I recently were talking about my father, who passed away some time ago. We think my dad didn't graduate from high school. My mom did, and went to a kind of what you call a secretarial school, I think, to get stenographic skills. So I didn't grow up in a home where education was really understood because my parents had no experience with college. My two older brothers went into the military right after they graduated from high school. So when I went to high school, big Kalamazoo Central High School, where virtually everybody went if they didn't go to a private school, I was put in the shop curriculum. So I never had, I'm an unlikely person to be a college professor, not just because of first generation college, but in high school I never had college English or anything like that. I was in mechanical drafting was my major. So if you weren't positioned to go on to college, you were either in auto shop, mechanical drafting, or architectural drafting, and I chose mechanical drafting. So I spent a lot of time drawing things in high school.
Well, then how did you decide to go to college, and how did you decide what to study when you got there?
Well, I look back on that, and I think a big influence in my going to college was a part-time job I had in a sporting goods store in Kalamazoo. I literally started when I was 14 years old on my birthday. That was what you did in the Elzinga family. That's when you got a working permit and you got a part-time job. So I was fortunate enough to get this job in a retail store that sold sporting goods called Lee's. And I worked there all through middle school, high school, and college. When I graduated, I was the longest serving employee at the sporting goods store. But my boss was a college graduate, and I spent many hours working in that store, and he encouraged me to get a college degree, and probably more of an explicit encouragement than I had with my mom and dad. My mom and dad would have been very comfortable with my getting a job. They weren't opposed to my going to college, it just wasn't talked about. But had I gotten a job in a paper mill in Kalamazoo, my parents would have been fine with that. As long as I worked hard and was honest about a day's work, that was really important in my family. So my boss said college, and I thought, well, if I had a college degree, what I'd like to do, and this is what I planned to do when I went to college, was be a fishing tackle salesman. Because I'd sold a lot of fishing tackle at retail, and I thought the cool thing was to sell it at wholesale. You have a company car, you drive around, you call on stores, and you sell fishing tackle equipment. But when I got to, I couldn't afford to go away to school, so I went to school in my hometown, which was Kalamazoo College. And when I got there, it was a liberal arts college, and the closest thing that seemed to be to business was the economics department. So I started taking econ and thinking that might help me be a fishing tackle salesman someday. And I can still remember going home. My mom died while I was in college, but I can remember going home and telling my dad I was going to major in economics. And he asked, well, what did that mean, or what did that involve? I really couldn't explain it to him, but I just knew that this was probably better than chemistry or German or something like that. So I was, as I say, an unlikely person to end up being a college professor. But at Kalamazoo College, I really was introduced to the liberal arts in a wonderful way. But there was a professor there, and he happened to be an econ professor, and he took an interest in me, and he saw, I don't know what he saw, potential, academic potential that nobody else had seen. I didn't see it myself, but he did. And he probably knew that I needed some special nurture and care, and I got that from him. I have an eternal debt to this guy, and I've thanked him many, many times for being a real important figure in my life. I'm a real example of how much difference a professor who cares can make in a student's life. I was a pretty poor student my first year at Kalamazoo College, as you would imagine. I never had any pre-college courses. By the time I was a junior, or what we would call a third-year student, I was a pretty decent student. And by the time I got to my fourth year, I sort of figured out how you do this. And it meant studying is what it meant, essentially. And I was a good student in my fourth year, and he encouraged me to go on to graduate school then.
And you did?
I did, yes. I didn't go very far because I, again, was very parochial. I couldn't imagine applying to a Yale or a Stanford. So the three graduate schools I considered were all about 80 miles from home. University of Chicago, University of Michigan, and Michigan State University. Because I'd lived at home. My mom and dad let me live at home without paying rent, and I had this part-time job, and I had a partial scholarship at Kalamazoo College. So that made K College affordable for me. Going away to graduate school, I thought, oh, I'm going to live in a dorm. I'm going to be leaving home. Where should I go? And I could only picture this very limited choice set. Now, they were all wonderful schools to consider, but I talk to my students today, and we talk about an international market for graduate school. It never would have occurred to me to go more than a 2-hour drive from home.
So I believe you settled on Michigan State.
I did, yes.
And I think there you were very influenced by Professor Walter Adams, am I right?
Yes, as much as Professor Cleland influenced me as an undergraduate, Professor Walter Adams influenced me as a graduate student. So I've had two professors, one undergraduate and one graduate school, who influenced me profoundly. I mean, I'm here at the University of Virginia because of Walter Adams. You know him a bit. He's a powerful personality, a charismatic person, and he wanted me to take a job at the University of Virginia. And he thought this would not only be a good fit for me, but he made a forecast, which I thought was crazy at the time. He always called me Mr. Elzinga, very Jeffersonian tradition. He said, Mr. Elzinga, you'll stay there the rest of your life. And I thought, well, maybe 3 years, and I wouldn't get promoted, and I'd go back to the Midwest. But his forecast was correct, so far at least.
Yes.
He just thought this would be a good place for me where I would be strongly incentivized to do research because it was a good department, but he also thought it was small enough that I wouldn't be overwhelmed by the size of the institution, and he thought it was a place where teaching would be valued as well. So he was right about that.
I'm beginning to get a glimpse of why you refer to teaching as a service or a calling. Could you comment a little bit about that?
Sure. It's a combination, I think, Terry, of seeing these people to whom I have a great debt, who took an interest in me. In addition, I really had a very deep connection or awakening to the Christian faith while I was in graduate school. And I became aware of this notion, it's very much from Calvin and Luther, of being called to a profession. And to my surprise, to Luther and Calvin, it was not just called to be a missionary or a minister or an evangelist. You could be called to be a dairy farmer. You could be called to be any number of secular professions. This is the way God got these things done, was calling people to do them. And I began to sense that I had call, a spiritual call to be a professor, and that the Christian faith legitimized that for me. That was okay. You weren't abandoning something that was more important or better in some hierarchical sense. People were called to all sorts of things, and I came to believe that I was called to be a professor. And beyond that, even the sense that I was called to be a professor here. I can't explain it fully. It's not something I would necessarily bleed and die over, but I do think it's true.
So I think you have been on the faculty, am I right, for 54 years?
I think that's right. I came here in the fall of 1967.
I believe you may be the longest serving member of the faculty. You know, in that period...
Actually, time out, because I think a colleague of your husband, Doug Laycock, has been here longer, and that's Dick Howard.
Oh,
I think
yes?
he's been here longer.
Well, it's not a contest.
Yeah, I've been here a while. It's safe to say I've been here for a while. In fact, one of the kind of funny things of being a professor here for this length of time, when you meet a first-year student in the college, and you've had this happen, but it's a little bit different for me if you're meeting them. Well, you're starting to see it now because you're teaching again, and you're in the trenches again with other faculty teaching classes. But when you meet a student for the first time, they're trying to think, I've never met a professor before. What do I ask this person? And the question is often, how long have you been at the university, Mr. Elzinga? And when I say since the fall of 1967, it's like a look of, are you kidding? Now, it's either a combination, like that's a long time, but for today's students, I'm sure what they're thinking is, wouldn't you get a different job by now? Because they all think a real flourishing career means 5 different employment opportunities.
Yeah.
At any rate, over 50 years now.
Yeah.
That's a stunner for me to think about that.
So you must have seen a lot of changes in the university since you arrived. Can you talk about a few of those?
Sure. Oh my goodness. Yeah, a lot of changes. The first big one for me was when the College of Arts and Sciences went co-ed, when women were enrolled, because when I first came here, I mean, you could imagine the sort of culture shock coming from Kalamazoo College and Michigan State University and coming into a setting where all of your students were boys and they were all wearing coats and ties. And then just a few years into that was this amazing change where women were welcome to be enrolled. And when I always admired President Shannon and the administration when they did this, because it wasn't in token fashion like it was feathered out over 5 years. All of a sudden, my classes were half male, half female. And that obviously was a big change in many ways, but one of the major ways was just the academic quality of the College of Arts and Sciences took a leap. It took a real leap. Now, and I have to be careful here. There were a lot of smart boys here when it was an all-male school. I met some incredibly smart kids, but the intensity of study in the classroom was not that high. There were smart kids who studied hard and showed themselves to be intellectually very talented, but there wasn't a lot of, I don't know the word, competition to really excel. And when the women came in, they were all, top of their high school classes, and they were here to learn and maybe to make a statement that they belonged here. And I remember in my antitrust policy class, which I teach Socratically, the level of Socratic dialogue just jumped when the women came in because they were really well prepared and they were ready to go. And some of the boys had to take notice of that, and they, oh wow, they didn't want to be embarrassed in front of these newcomers. So that was a big change. Another change over time was just it was a pretty white student body when I came here, and that has really changed. The size of the student body has changed a lot. The university is much larger. The college is much larger than when I came here, but some things haven't changed. The courtesy of UVA students towards me as a faculty member, teaching a big class. You walk into the Chem auditorium, and this has been the case for years, to go in and you start the lecture and the students quiet down. And they don't talk, they don't get up and walk around, they don't leave until it's time to leave. Cell phones don't go off. Office hours have still been just kind of magical for me, of a time to meet with students and relate to them in a mature way. And that was here when I got here and in place, and that continues to be the place, the way it is. Athletics, too, would be another area that's changed. We didn't have a lot of national champions around here in sports when I first arrived. In fact, the funny thing was, you know the Big Ten culture because you've been a part of that, coming from Michigan State yourself. Coming here in football in particular, I was dumbfounded because we did not have good football teams in those days. And the students seemed to be, some of them, seemed to have a kind of a perverse pride that, well, that was for other schools to be good in sports, we lost. Wow, I don't know what our rankings are, but we have athletic programs to really be proud of here. But the other thing I'll say, again, coming from Michigan State and a very powerful athletic subculture, I have been so impressed by the coaches that I've met here. I've taught a lot of students here, somewhere north of 45,000 students, and a lot of them are athletes. I have never had a coach or anybody from the athletic department approach me in any way that would even come close to being inappropriate about a student's academic performance and eligibility and so on, who was a student athlete. And the coaches I've met, I just uniformly admire them. I really do. They want to win, to be sure, but there just seemed to be a moral integrity or fiber to the athletic department here, at least as I've experienced it over the years, that's been a constant. I really have appreciated that about UVA.
So I understand that you also do some mission work, and I wonder if you could tell us just a little bit about that.
Yeah, I've been on the boards of a number of Christian organizations. One of them has a chapter here, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. And from time to time, I've gone on missions trips to some fairly hard places. Cambodia, recently to Bosnia, after there had been just a tragic civil war there. I've been to Egypt, lived in the garbage village there for a while, been to Mongolia after it had been under a very repressive regime with regard to all religions, including the Christian faith. I don't stay long enough to have any sense of like I've suffered in any way, because I haven't. But I've lived in some hard places and visited Christians and mission organizations and training centers that organizations I've been a part of have helped foster and build. And these have been very important experiences for me, in part to meet people of my faith who live under very different conditions. The garbage village in Cairo is a very hard place, and yet in some ways it's a place of great joy and fellowship and obedience to the things of Christ. My wife has really been the real trooper here. My wife, Terry, who's a graduate of UVA, she's been to Bolivia several times with a medical team that's gone out from Charlottesville to do surgery at Mission of Hope. She's been in Africa several times in hard places. She's done a lot of missions trips, somewhat to help us understand the broader world, to help us understand where we not only want to give time, but our own resources. So that's been an important part of my life, is these opportunities to travel and see different parts of the world, sometimes in hard places.
I dare say that makes you a congenial faculty member for our international students.
Yeah, it has, and that's been another big change. I didn't have a lot of international students when I first started teaching here, and now much more international composition. I spend a lot of time, in particular, with students from China, and have had the pleasure of officiating in the weddings of some of my students from China who don't have home churches or home pastors here. And I've been to China. We had a student live with us for a year from China. We've had some great experiences with international students here.
Yes. So I recall hearing that you lived on the lawn at one time.
I did.
Yeah,
yes.
So tell us what it was like to live on the lawn then.
Oh my goodness, it was a tremendous experience. One of the highlights of my career at UVA was living in Pavilion 4, where Larry Sabato now lives. So my wife and I were invited to live in Pavilion 4. I had won a teaching award, and out of that award came the opportunity to live on the lawn. And this was a real treat for me in a number of ways. It was a treat for my wife, too, because she's a graduate of the architecture school. So to live in a home designed by Thomas Jefferson was pretty unique. But for me, quite apart from here I put my economist hat on, reducing the transactions costs of getting to Rouse Hall and getting back home was really quick. But one of the things I loved and hadn't expected is when you live on the lawn, you move into a neighborhood, and your neighbors are other pavilion residents, but so are the students, particularly those right around your pavilion. But my wife and I, we didn't have children, and I'm not a dean or a vice president, so I had no real stakeholder obligations to entertain other organizations or people. So we just decided to make that front room available to students. And if you wanted to have a meeting there, or if you were in an a cappella group and you wanted to do auditions there, or you want to have a seminar there, we just said, we want you to use that room. So virtually every day of the week, I'd come home from my office in Rouse Hall, I'd look on the refrigerator downstairs, and I'd say, okay, the VGs are doing auditions upstairs. And I could go upstairs and say hi if I wanted to, but I didn't have to. And they would, and this is the virtue of the honor system. And we did this for 10 years, Terry. We never had anything taken or stolen, and we never worried about that because these were students at UVA. So they would come in through the lower level and go up in the main room and do their thing, whether it was singing or a class or a seminar or whatever, and they would leave. And we loved that. We just loved that we could make this place available, which was the whole Mr. Jefferson's idea anyway.
Right.
And then we had a dog. We had an English bulldog named Rotunda. And Rotunda loved living on the lawn because we'd come home sometimes and Rotunda would be gone. And we would look to see, is the leash gone? And if the leash was gone, then we knew some students had come in the house, gotten Rotunda because they missed their dog, and taken Rotunda for a walk, and eventually Rotunda always made her way back. And one year, the lawnies have a vote of who's the best lawnie. One year, Rotunda won as the best lawnie on the lawn. She loved that. When we moved back home, she thought life really was boring because we didn't have these students come in every day. There'd be students come in and make out over Rotunda. And it was a great name. My wife picked the name Rotunda. She has Rotunda on the license plate of her car, and people think it's the building, but it's the dog.
The dog.
It's the dog.
So I understand that you have some interesting hobbies. Trick water skiing, antique cars.
Well, I'm pleased you asked that because my wife thinks I'm a workaholic. So it's always good to be reminded that I have these hobbies. I do enjoy water skiing a lot. I grew up in Michigan. My family didn't have the means to have a boat, but the sporting goods store where I worked, there was a guy who had a boat. So he would take me water skiing, and he was a good water skier. So I learned about slalom skiing and trick skiing. We didn't do jumps, but those were the three main events: tricks, slalom, and jumping. And then I came to Virginia, where there's hardly any lakes. And one day I saw an ad in the Cavalier Daily, water ski lessons. I'll give you a water ski lesson if you'll pay for the gas. And I thought, well, that's a good deal. I don't know as though I want a lesson, but I'm happy to pay for gas. So I went to Lake Monticello, the only lake nearby, and here was a grad student who had a boat, and he was looking for somebody to ski with and buy the gas. And so I thought, oh, there's a lake out here. So then we bought a summer place there, and I bought a ski boat, and that started some fairly serious, as a hobby, of slalom skiing and trick skiing. Trick skiing, if you don't know, is you have a ski about this long. You usually start with 2, but you graduate to 1, and it has no keel on it. So it can ski in any direction. It can ski sideways. You can do turns and spins on it. And I enjoy that. And I enjoy slalom skiing. And I have some wonderful ski buddies at Lake Monticello, but I also have taught a lot of students how to ski, or if they know how to ski, to help them advance in their skiing. My greatest thrill in water skiing was teaching a blind UVA student how to ski.
Oh.
It was a very moving experience for her and for me because I realized what trust she was placing in me as her teacher and boat driver. But I've taught a lot of kids how to water ski. In fact, sometimes I don't even remember, and they'll tell me later that I taught them how to slalom ski, and I don't quite remember that. It's a really fun sport in terms of socializing, because while obviously you can't visit with the person when they're out at the end of the rope, but when they're not skiing, when somebody else is skiing, they're sitting right next to you in the boat, and so you can talk and get to know them, and then it's fun. You're outdoors and so on. The car thing, I grew up in Michigan, and in my era, you just didn't grow up in Michigan as a boy, at least, and not be fascinated by cars. So a few years ago, I joined the local car club here in Charlottesville, which is an interesting group culturally. I mean, even from your expertise as demographics, it's interesting, because nobody gives a rip what you've written or where you got degrees from or anything like that. You could be the mailman, or you could be a cardiologist. It's what kind of car do you have? Tell me about it, and let's talk about cars. It's a fun group for me. But anyway, I had a 32 Ford, which now lives, somebody else has that car now. That's kind of the iconic American street rod, is the 32 Ford. And I had a 49 Mercury, which car guys call a lead sled, the way it was customized. The most interesting and valuable car I ever had was a 68 Mustang that was rebuilt as a replica in a way of a very famous car in a movie called, the car was called Eleanor, and the movie was Gone in 60 Seconds. So after Bullet, it's the most famous Mustang in movies. And that car became so valuable that I really didn't dare drive it to work anymore. And I always wanted a car that I could at least drive to work or to Barracks Road or something. So the opportunity cost of owning that car got so high, and I was so afraid somebody would do something to it. It now is actually in Poland. A collector in Poland bought that car.
Goodness.
It was quite a vehicle. It was so stunning that I would have sometimes people follow me home to see the car. They would want to see it so much. Right now, it's a fairly mundane car that I have. It's a 2007 Shelby Mustang. Very fast, but I don't drive it rapidly. And it's a funny car because I'll meet a student who likes cars, and I'll say, "You want to drive my Mustang?" And it's a 6-speed stick shift, and kids today don't know how to drive a manual transmission. So there is a boy, I'm going to teach him how to drive a stick shift. I'm going to trust him with my Shelby Mustang. But no, it's been a fun hobby, in part because it's so different than the academic culture. It really is. So occasionally I'll go to a car show if I'm in the neighborhood of a really good car museum like the Peterson in LA. The LeMay in Tacoma is arguably the best car museum in the United States right now, oddly enough, in Tacoma, Washington, far from Detroit. But I love to go to a car museum. I like art museums too, but car museums are pretty special.
Just think if you'd taken that auto shop curriculum instead of the mechanical drawing.
You're right. Oh my goodness, we wouldn't be having this conversation. We wouldn't, because I would be working as a mechanic somewhere. Or maybe a designer and rebuilder of cars. Maybe I would have moved into that.
Oh.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. It's a good question.
But it's good to have hobbies. You can't just grind away all the time at your work.
I know you're not supposed to. You can if you feel called to it, and you have, and if I'll just put it this way, I have to pinch myself sometimes to think I have this job. I mean, it's hard. It's no fun grading blue books and that sort of thing. But for the most part, to have the ability to work with young people and do research in directions that you want to do, and be in Charlottesville at this university, I'm a very fortunate guy. I really am. And if I have to work long hours, well, that's okay.
So, who's Marshall Jevons, and how well do you know him?
I know Marshall Jevons pretty well because I was a co-creator of Marshall Jevons. Marshall Jevons, as you know, is the pen name or pseudonym for me when I write mystery novels. Marshall Jevons is my pen name. It's the combination of the last name of two economists, Alfred Marshall and William Stanley Jevons, although the philosophers claim Jevons as well, but economists claim him also. When I first started teaching here, I was so fortunate to have a mentor, not assigned to me, but a colleague, a tenured member of the department, who came alongside me, knowing that I was really green, and encouraged me to. So you hear this expression, publish or perish, like it's either or. And there's some truth to that. You have to make hard decisions about how much effort are you going to put into publishing, because if you don't publish, you won't get tenure. And some people see that as, well, that means you just don't put any weight on your teaching at all because you need to publish or you perish. And I was so fortunate when I arrived here, and a colleague, Professor William Bright, came alongside me and really encouraged me to be a good teacher, which I wanted to be because I had had these two good teachers in my life, as well as others, but particularly Professor Cleland and Professor Adams. Adams was a powerful classroom presence. So he said, Ken, I was teaching this big principles class, and he really helped me try to do it well and kept me from mistakes too. Oh my goodness, kept me from mistakes. But then on the publishing front, he really encouraged me. He said, Ken, you can do this. I thought I'd be here 3 years, Terry, and that would be it. I didn't think I would get promoted. I had no confidence that that was going to happen. But he said, no, really work on this. And I had a couple ideas, and I tried to get something out of my dissertation. This is a footnote, but to show you how naive I was, none of the graduate students would be this way anymore. I came here, and I had a doctoral dissertation written under Professor Adams. And I didn't know what to do with it. I knew I was supposed to publish something out of it. And Adams told me that Ronald Coase at the University of Chicago, who was the editor of the Journal of Law and Economics, might find what's in my doctoral dissertation of interest. So you know what I did? I will admit this to you now. I wouldn't have told you this 20 years ago because you would think less of me. I sent the whole dissertation in a jiffy bag to Ronald Coase saying, my professor said there might be something here of interest in the JLE. Why Coase didn't just put that in the trash, I don't know. Maybe it was because I was so naive that he took pity on me, but he looked at the dissertation and he said, wrote me back, and yeah, chapter 2 and 3 might be of interest to me in the JLE. So I had just a wonderful publication, but just, I don't know, people took pity on my naivete or something that I didn't put it in the I didn't know to even put it in the JLE format at the time. So at any rate, Bright encouraged me to publish, he encouraged me to teach well, and I really tried to do that. But then he loved murder mysteries, and he was a dear friend, he was a bachelor, and he would go on vacation with my wife and me. That's how much we cared for him, how much he cared for me and my wife. We would go on vacation together, and he would take a bag of mysteries along because he loved mysteries, and I would usually take some Christian books, and we'd compare notes at dinner time, what we were reading. And one day he said, there has never been a fictional character in all of mystery genre who used economics to solve the crime. Now that didn't surprise me at all. I thought, well, yeah, that sounds about right. But he said, we ought to create that. And no, I said, you ought to create such a figure because you know mysteries. And he said he would take a stab at it if I would do it with him. So my wife went home. We were on the island of St. John at Canil Bay Plantation. Bill and I stayed an extra week to try and think about creating a fictional character. And we did, Henry Spearman, and we did a book. But we were afraid because we didn't know how good or bad it was, to put our own names on it. So we picked a pseudonym, Marshall Jevons. And when the book first came out, it didn't have our names on it. It just said Marshall Jevons. Mm-hmm. And the book was reviewed in the Wall Street Journal.
Goodness.
And that will really increase the demand for a book, we learned. But the editor of the journal called me. I still remember I was sitting in the basement of Rouse Hall in room B18 and called and said, we're going to review Murder at the Margin in the Wall Street Journal. I said, really? And he said, we'd like to use your names. We know that you're not Marshall Jevons, that you're two professors. We've done our homework on you. And we'd like to use your names in the review. And I thought, oh my word, what do I do? So I had the presence of mind to ask, can you tell me if it's a good review? And I still remember his words. He says, I think you'll be pleased. Uh-huh. And I said, well, you may use our names then. So after that, we put our names on the book. But Professor Bright passed away a few years ago. It was a great hit for me. We were very dear friends, and I owe a great debt to him for my career, in addition to getting me into mystery writing, which has been a fun sideline for me. And again, one of the reasons the job is the sort of pinch you kind of job is, what other job would you have where you could have the freedom, the liberty to do something as quirky as write a murder mystery and have it published by Princeton University Press? I mean, that's different. That's part of the genius of UVA is you have the freedom to do these different things. For me, it's like going back to my liberal arts background, where I had to go kicking and screaming into English literature classes and write things, and now bring it back to job as an econ professor, and all of a sudden I'm going to meetings of the Mystery Writers of America with all these humanists. And who gets to do that? Well, you get to do that at Mr. Jefferson's University.
I think I read somewhere that in the Department of Economics there's a Marshall Jevons scholarship.
There's Marshall Jevons this came out of my antitrust consulting, which has been another element of my life that I never would have expected to be, that my expertise in economics would lead me to be a consultant in antitrust cases. I was an economic expert in a case that was just tried before the Supreme Court just a week ago, the NCAA case. But once I was a consultant for a guy in the grocery industry for his firm, it was Safeway. And the episode turned out well from the company standpoint. He wanted to do something for me. And I said, well, no, I've been paid already. I don't know, what do you mean, do something for me? He said, I want to do something for you. And I said, well, I've been paid handsomely, but what about something for my students? Could you do something on that? And he said, well, we could give money that you could have as a fund to help students do research. I said, that would be great. And then he was the one that named it. He said, we're going to call it the Marshall Jevons Fund. So I had the joy, that's the right word, joy, of seeing thousands of dollars go to undergraduates to do research at UVA, and it's funded by the Marshall Jevons Fund. How cool is that?
That is cool.
And so students have been able to buy books and data, but what's the most fun for me is to have a student doing a project in a certain area, and you can say, there's a conference on that in New York, and why don't you apply for Marshall Jevons funding and go to that conference? And I've had students go to the conference in some city, and they fly there, it's all paid for, and they'll say, I went to this conference and I was the only undergraduate there. And because it's a conference on intellectual property or something like that. And what has happened, Terry, is they find themselves not shunted off because they're an undergraduate. They're exotic in some way. And people say, come sit at our table. And they're warmly welcomed over and over again. Oh, you're from UVA. And then there's usually somebody there who went to UVA, and of course they glom onto them. So they go in kind of cautious and insecure, as I would have been, and they're welcomed. And that's been especially fun for me, to have people be able to go. And then, as you know, undergraduate research has just become a much bigger deal here. It's a huge change in undergraduates' aspirations. And so in the econ department, we say, yeah, we got money to fund that. And the original fund has been depleted, but other alumni have come along and said, we want to keep this going. So we have never had to turn anybody down because we didn't have funds.
That's a wonderful story, and it's wonderful for your students too.
Yeah, well, you can imagine what a kick it is for me too, to be able to tell somebody, we can fund that, we can get that for you. Years ago, we didn't have that. I knew that the Ivy League schools had research funds available for things like that, but we've got it now. And I'm so grateful for some of my students, some of them I know by name, who have given to keep this fund going. But it all came from a consulting assignment and somebody wanting to do something for me, and I said, well, do something for my students, and he came up with the idea of that Marshall Jevons Fund.
Great idea.
Yeah.
So, one last question. Since the COVID pandemic began, we've been teaching remotely. You teach a lot of students, and now you teach a lot of students on Zoom. What's that been like?
Yeah, well, technically, I decided not to do the Zoom route.
Oh.
I teach this big class in the fall, Econ 201, and we had a record number last fall, 1,300 students, because I was not confined to the constraint of the Chem auditorium. Typically, that class is capped at 1,000 because of the number of seats available. But this year I was able to let everybody in who wanted to attend the class. But I was leery of, I'm an old guy. I was leery of the Zoom technology and just the uncertainty each day. Is it going to work all right? So I spent much of the summer beforehand going to a studio and having a setup not quite as exotic as this one, but we had 2 cameras and we had professional lights, and I recorded all my lectures beforehand and then would play them on Tuesday and Thursday. So it was very different format, but I tried to replicate the Chem auditorium in this studio as best I could from my standpoint. That said, I don't know what the right word is. Depressed is too strong a word, but I was sad to teach in front of 2 cameras. No offense to the cameraman here recording this. We appreciate what you do, but I would much rather be live and in person in front of my students. And even one of the people running the cameras said to me one time, said, "I know you're trying hard, but you're not really enthused about this, are you?" And I said, "No, I wish I could be back in the Chem auditorium in front of my students and doing that." And I so much look forward to next fall when we can, I'm hoping we able to go back and teach live and in person. I was holding office hours this morning, and I'm starting to hold them live in my office again now, and socially distanced, if Jim Ryan is watching this. And one of the boys I was talking to, Jacob Moore, I think was his name, first-year student, and it was very poignant. He said, "This is the first time I've met a professor that I could talk to this year, first-year kid, and we're well into the second semester, and we were sitting about 6 feet apart, and he said, 'This is the first time that I've seen a professor live.'" And oh my goodness, that is so sad, because it's sad anywhere, but especially at UVA, where the college experience is such a special time for students, not just academically, but the whole DNA of the place is so magic. And for first-year students, the honor convocation, all these things that are part of being a UVA student that these kids didn't have a chance to capture. And it's hard to go back and capture it again.
So I've started holding, when the weather is nice, I've started holding my office hours outdoors.
Oh, good.
Because then we're not only socially distanced, but you don't have to worry about the ventilation.
Yeah.
And so this week was the first time I've seen a student live since I got
Isn't
back
that something?
in the fall. Yes, it is.
And we're in April.
Yeah.
I just have to say, I am so pleased that you have gone into the classroom. I wrote you this in an email. I just think that is so special to be able to say, president of my university was president, and she was a distinguished president, an administrator. She's been a provost, and now she's back teaching, and teaching undergraduates as well. I just think that's really special. I think, if I'm correct on this, there have been 9 presidents of the University of Virginia. I have served under 6 of them, and a number of them have gone back into the classroom after their time in administration. And I just think that's a very special thing. Maybe it happens at other universities. I don't think so. But I just think that's so special that a person can live up in Carter's Hill and be the president of the place and then come back and an undergraduate could take classes with them. Wow.
Well, Ken, I think you and I both understand that being a full professor at the University of Virginia is one of the best jobs in the world.
It is a good job. It really is.
So I'm happy to do that, and I'm happy to have you as a colleague.
Well.
And thank you for sharing these thoughts about your work with us.
Well, it's been fun to be with you.